The Abandoned Asylum. Have you ever wondered if madness is something more than a mental illness? Maybe it leaves an impression on a place, like a stain that never washes away. I have always had an ability to sense the emotions of a place. Churches are a good example. Walking into one, you just get a feeling of all the things the walls have held within them. The joys of marriages, the grief of funerals, even pride of baptisms and christenings. Maybe I'm just overly empathetic to these things. But something happened a few years ago that made me really start to ask if it's not just me. But in the end, I still have more questions than I do answers. I work in construction, specifically demolition. I travel up and down the state for my job. I live out of a duffel bag and I've slept in more hotels than my own bed for most of the year. My roommates have genuinely forgotten my name on more than one occasion. So when I got to work that morning to see all the tools and equipment of my trade being loaded onto trailers and all the guys throwing their various suitcases and backpacks, I knew it was going to be some time before I was anywhere near my home again. I offered up an apology to the houseplants that I had recently purchased, as they would probably be yet another sacrifice to the all-consuming need for a paycheck. I trudged into the office to see where my next job was going to take me. I grabbed that big red folder out of my mail slot to examine its contents of the new project we'd be taking on as I walked into my project manager's office. "I've never even heard of this town," I moaned, deciding to start the day by irritating my boss, Tom. "That's because you were born in this century," Tom replied, without looking up from his computer. "This place is pretty much stuck out of time," he said, finally looking up. "It used to be a mining town back in the 50s, and from what I can tell, once they shut down the mine, the town just kind of refused to die. But that's not our concern. What is our concern is that we're getting at least part of the contract to demo an old mental hospital." "Part of the contract?" I asked, already suspecting the answer would not be to my liking. "Victor's got the cleanup, we got the demo," he said flatly, looking at me with a heavy implication to not start with him on this. I fixed my gaze on the calendar on the wall above his desk, and I was idly wondering how long it would be until I saw my own bed again, when he spoke up. "By the way, just to keep you in the loop on this one, don't expect the warm welcome from the locals. They are not happy about this building being sent for demo. Apparently this place has some local history, and it's been a hotbed for local disputes," he said rather casually, trying to convey that our crew could be expected to get into confrontations with the locals, and expect no help from any business in the immediate area. "Awesome," I said, sarcastically. Before leaving the office, the drive into this place was almost as unsettling as the town itself. I know some people find endless rolling hills to be majestic, but after miles of dry grass-covered hills, I started to feel as drained of life as the landscape around me. There was something oppressive about the air here, like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting. "This is gonna suck," I said aloud to the crew cab full of guys I was about to spend the next few weeks supervising. None of them responded. The silence felt thick, unnatural, but that was my job, supervising. I'm an engineer for the company. My job really consists of overseeing the operation, solving all the little day-to-day problems, and logistically making sure we can stay on schedule and within budget. This responsibility manifests in any number of ways, ranging from equipment repair, making sure our vendors deliver supplies on time, as well as planning demolition in a manner that makes the most sense, given the available resources. Seeing as I was already warned by Tom that our arrival would not exactly be greeted with loving open arms, I wasn't looking forward to the challenges of this assignment. After our arrival, we had one of those idiotic, groundbreaking ceremonies that I truly despise. I'd been wondering when we drove in what flavor of time-wasting nonsense I'd be subjected to. The golden shovel variety? Maybe the giant scissors and big red ribbon. Either way, they're always a waste of precious time. Photo opportunities and people in suits. People who will never step foot on the job until after it's complete. And me, I'll have to stand there over actual blueprints, with people who have zero idea what they're even looking at, posing for a camera. Somehow, the thought of standing next to one of these idiots for a photo was even more distasteful than the growing stack of concerns, foolishness, and general havoc this assignment was about to bring. But we did it. Me standing there pointing at irrelevant points on a blueprint, with some mayor or government official standing by my side, nodding approval for an all-too-willing news crew. I wanted to use that golden shovel to bring an end to all of them, and in hindsight, I would have been doing them a favor. Standing shoulder to shoulder with city officials always made me uncomfortable, and by God, these people didn't help the situation. A greasy-looking man in a cheap suit sidled up to me during the last of the group photography. He had the look of a used car salesman going through multiple divorces, all at the same time. Haggard would have been generous to say the least of his demeanor, having all the calming presence of a man who had been held at gunpoint more than once in his years. He began to speak in a quiet, conspiratorial tone. Even before I acknowledged his odor of cheap whiskey, and even cheaper cologne, I gave my best effort to maintain my fragile composure. As he began what I was already sure was a useless synopsis of how local government works, and who I should try to make friends with if I wanted this project to succeed, I cut him off. "Not interested," I began. "What?" he said, feigning innocence. "Look, I'm just not interested in pitches, deals, or inside scoops on who's who in this town. We're here to do a job and see it through to completion with minimal interference. We have more than enough of our own resources to see it get done without greasing any wheels or taking any deals." I lied. I hadn't even turned my head to look at him, trying to focus on the cameraman and where he was angling for a good shot for what I guessed would be the local paper. "I was just wondering if you knew the story behind the building you're about to destroy," he asked, with the first tone of actual sincerity in his voice. I had heard a dozen of these speeches before, on why a particular place needed to be preserved or turned into a historical site. They come from a good place, but the sad reality is, I work for the sort of progress, not the preservation of the past, or at least, that's what I believed at the time. That old things should make way for the new. "I'm here to do a job, that's all," I said, trying to instill a note of finality in my voice. "Men like you always are," he said. And something about his words were laden with the sadness I couldn't quite place as genuine or manufactured. He moved away from me sheepishly, and I felt a little bad inside, as I finally turned to see him fully, and beheld someone deeply broken by years of loss and public service. We didn't make it through the first day before things started going sideways. It began with equipment failures. Machines that had been designed to break apart concrete and mortar began to malfunction at the very lowest end of their expected workload. I was already cursing upper management by 10 a.m. for sending me the worst of their tool lot, when Tom called me. "So, the start," he said, before even a perfunctory hello. "Not great," I replied. "You really sent me the cream of the crop here for equipment." "Totally top shelf, Tom," I said, putting as much emphasis on his name as possible. Accusatory tone aside, he continued, as if I had said nothing of note. 36 days, Alan. That's your deadline. We're counting on you to get this done as fast as possible, if we're going to make it profitable." A number of profane words came to mind as I contemplated my reply. "Yes, sir," I answered, in a way that I really hoped would convey my contempt for him and his higher-ups. At the end of the first day, I was looking over incident reports and equipment logs to try and see how bad the short end of the stick I'd been given for this job really was. My first priority was the tools. Why had this equipment broken down, and what could be done about it? My conclusion only left me scratching my head. The company had not sent me bad equipment. The maintenance logs were basically perfect. Some of these things I'd overseen the repair of myself, or by a tech that I knew was reliable. Then why, I wondered, in my hotel room,
Could I not see any reason for the failures? These machines had been operating at full capacity over the last few jobs, and had been maintained properly. So why fail now? I racked my mind for an answer, and got nothing, except for open-ended questions in return. I decided then, it was time for a proper drink, and to go down to the local bar. I needed distance from maintenance logs, and performance schedules. More time to reflect, and think upon my current situation. As I walked into the bar, by accident still wearing my company hat and vest, I was greeted with about as much warmth as bone cancer. The glares of the patrons there gave me all I needed to know about how welcome I was at their establishment. Outsider read clearly on the countless faces littering the bar. The decision to avail myself of the outside patio area was clearly the smart choice, after a half-hearted attempt by the bartender to make a whiskey sour. The poor sad excuse for a drink was already halfway down my throat, before it registered in my mind that violence was clearly reading out on several of the patrons' faces. My already addled mind wondered if I would make it out of this bar without having to defend myself for the trouble. Outside on the patio, I spotted the man who had tried to talk to me during the photo op. He had procured himself a table in the far corner, away from anyone or anything. The only thing keeping him company was a number of empty pint glasses. His blurry eyes met mine, and he motioned for me to join him in the empty seat across from him. I decided against my better instinct to join him, as just about everyone else in the bar looked as though they would have offered a pint glass to the side of my head, rather than exchange any pleasantries. "Come on, have a seat," he offered me the seat by way of pushing the chair out with his foot. I obliged him, setting my half-finished whiskey on the table, as he offered his hand to me. We got off on the wrong foot. "I'm John," I took his hand. "Alan," I offered. "Don't worry about them," he said, vaguely gesturing at the inside of the bar. "They may give you all the death glares, but for the most part, they're harmless." "For the most part?" I asked. "Well, aside from the local paramilitary that lives deep up in the hills, but they rarely come down, due to all the warrants for their arrests most of them have," he stated, as if it wasn't a big deal. "Oh, so nothing to worry about." I glared at him, letting the sarcasm seep into my voice and gaze. "They aren't coming down from the mountain just to mess up this project," he tried to reassure me, but the slight slurring of his words wasn't offering much in the way of surety. "Let me try to explain something to you." He seemed to be trying to gather himself. That building was more than just some small care facility. It was the repository for a lot of grief and misery over the years. It's failed in just about every incarnation it's been through the years, and that was before the incident. "Incident?" I inquired. "I'll get to that," he started again. "That building has been the site of every failed public program in this town. Doesn't matter what the work project is, they all fail. And those people in there are beaten down and weary from years of being made promises only to have their hopes of something better happening dashed over and over again. Getting kids to read, no source of books. Illiteracy rate here is worse than you might think. Internship for work, no business wanted to support it. Unemployment skyrocketed, with a whole workforce of interns trained to a job no one wanted them to do. And then the crown jewel of failure is the rehab program, supposed to take the mentally ill, the homeless, the addicts, and all the people that place failed, and help them get back to being functional members of society. You want to guess how that turned out? He spat. This is the part where you tell me about the incident, I ventured. This is the part where I tell about a failure that resulted in 6 people losing their lives, including my son, he said, apparently having completely sobered up. During his description, his words had struck me. I let my guard down and listened to his words more carefully. The rest of the evening John bought the drinks, and I listened, taking down occasional notes of certain things he said. Names, dates, events that he said had taken place. It's not that I didn't believe him. But I had a way. I like to do things in situations that have this much potential to go sideways.
Trust, but always verify. By the time we left, my notes had begun to slightly wander off the pages, and my usually neat handwriting had a bit of a slant to it. John, even in his state, gave off a certain air of confidence, walking me out of that bar that prevented any of the establishment's occupants from requiring any physical confrontation before we opened the front door to a waiting cab. He opened the door, turned to me, and as he did so, he said, "Consider it a professional courtesy. I do wish you luck in tearing down that God-forsaken building. It's been an ugly reminder through all the years that it has stood of the greed and incompetence of our local government. But every contractor that's ever tried to do anything with that building has failed." And without another word, he got into the cab. I watched the taillights disappear over the hill woozily, taking out my keys as I walked back to my work truck. I could smell the spray paint before I even got to it. There in big red letters was a single word: leave. It had been painted down the entire side of my truck. I sighed wearily. This is gonna be great, saying aloud in the open night air. I got back to my hotel room after an unenthusiastic officer came to take my statement. I didn't even want to call, knowing my report would go straight into the filing cabinet under a big W. For who cares? But company policy required it for insurance purposes. I sat at the little desk of the hotel room, and I fired up my laptop, digging my notebook out and deciphering my slightly drunken scroll. I began to do some research into the conversation with John. Again, it wasn't that I didn't believe him, but sob stories were kind of a dime a dozen in this industry. It didn't take long before I found confirmation to almost every one of the building's failed endeavors, including the one that involved the death of his son. I pored over the article, which was written by a newspaper outside of the town, so it contained a lot more details about the incident. Maybe it was the whiskey still floating around in my veins, or the fact that John had looked so haggard, but my heart sank when I read a paragraph towards the end of the article, describing what had plagued the rehabilitation program. It cited budget issues that had resulted in the place being horribly understaffed with what could best be called underqualified people, citing this as the reason for the tragedy at the facility that had claimed the life of John's son, who was working the front desk reception at the time. The architect of the budget had been brought up on criminal charges, but none of them stuck. The courtroom sketch was the man being held responsible for the crime, if maybe only in the public eye. Even in the poorly painted courtroom sketch, I recognized John's wary, haggard expression. I went to bed that night, thinking of this poor man, who had in a way, if perhaps only inadvertently, in the course of doing his job as a public servant, caused these circumstances that surrounded his son's demise, and then had been made a public pariah to be charged in it all. The next morning, the phone in the little trailer that was serving as my office began to ring. I cursed under my breath. Last night's events had produced a profound headache, which Tom's nasally wheedling voice only seemed to make worse. "Well, I have good news for you," Tom chirped with an enthusiasm that made me despise the man and the entire concept of hearing anything at all. "Victor's just filed for Chapter 11. Tom had said that with the inflection of a lion who had just learned all the gazelle forgot how to run. We have the whole contract. Everything about this job now falls under you, Alan." He sounded like it was a privilege, and not just simply adding more weight to the burden I was already bearing. I intentionally moved the phone receiver closer to my nose, so he could hear my long exhale of acceptance and frustration. "Great," I said, through gritted teeth. "I'll update you as things progress," and I hung up the phone. The next few weeks progressed as painlessly as a tooth extraction without anesthesia. Equipment failed, deliveries were delayed, and worst of all, morale among the crew plummeted. Confrontations became more common. Don't get me wrong, I'm used to dealing with conflict resolution. The guys I work with, the crews I manage, are largely made up of the tough guy types, and tough guy types don't like wearing their ear protection. Half or more of the conflicts I have to deal with are about miscommunication rather than actual insults. A routine hearing test by our insurance company produced a result that nearly half our guys had some loss in the hearing department. And despite multiple meetings about the importance of safety equipment, the problem persisted. I was about to chalk the most recent batch of conflict resolution reports up to the stress of this job when I saw the name in the report. Ramirez. Okay, that makes no sense at all, I thought. Ramirez had always been a very peaceful man. I even relied on him for conflict resolution. He was a deeply religious guy who didn't believe in violence in the least. Wonder what made him lose his cool, I thought, as I read the report. I tried to picture a gentle guy like Ramirez in a jail cell. Again, I came up scratching my head. What was going on here? My cell phone vibrated in my pocket. Tom's office number brightened the screen. I debated tossing the phone into the running wood chipper for a brief moment. I begrudgingly decided against it, but I let it go to voicemail. I really didn't have the time for his overly litigious nonsense right now. 2 of my guys had been taken into custody last night, via the back of a squad car, after an altercation with some locals at the bar. And I'd already spent half the morning on the phone with our legal department, trying to figure out how to bail them out. My phone then chimed in with a new email. I rolled my eyes hard and looked at the notification. It was a response email that had been CC'd to our branch supervisors. That was never good. I'd been trying to address the problem of vandalism at the job site. When Victor's had pulled up stakes after the company went under, they'd sold their equipment to us after we took over their entire contract. But what we had failed to acquire in the buyout was their night security team. The sheer dollar amount of equipment that had to be left at the job most evenings was basically a big pot of gold for every thief in the area. And confrontations with the unhoused, who were used to camping out on the grounds, were a continuing problem. I'd already rung up several charges on my corporate account, buying some of our tools back from the local pawn shop, even after contacting them and asking as politely as possible to be on the lookout for our branded tools that bore our company logo. Even though they clearly belonged to us, local police had sided with shop owners, and I had to pay to get our stolen property back. I went into my little trailer office so I could read the email on a proper screen, instead of trying to squint at my phone. And immediately, I knew I was really going to be unhappy by the time I was done. It was first a denial for my request for a night security guard. The corporate jargon that followed stated in simple words, "We don't want to spend money on you." I was already pinching the bridge of my nose when I scrolled down to the second page, and I felt my face get hot. Expansion of supervisor job duties. Not only was I not getting a security guard, I was now going to be responsible for any theft or loss of time or property. And just to add some terrible icing to an already lousy cake, my corporate account had been severely limited in what I was allowed to spend it on. I could hear Tom's weaselly voice as I read the words cost reduction measures. I put my head down on what was passing for a desk with a groan, wondering when was the last time I updated my resume. Part of the email had been sent to me directly, and not to the rest of the supervisors. It was a note from Tom. All it said was maybe you could put a cot in the site trailer. As I paced about the trailer, going through every obscene word I had in stock, a light bulb came on, and 2 words flashed across my mind. Malicious compliance. A dark smile began to form as I checked the company policy book for our specific guidelines about reasonable accommodations. I found the clause I was looking for and highlighted it. This was going to be my shield. I called the hotel I was staying in and canceled my reservation for the rest of the job. 2 hours later, I pulled the 30-foot rented luxury class 5th wheel into the job site wearing a huge grin. I could already picture Tom's red face as he looked over an expense report,
Seeing how much I had just spent on my new accommodations, knowing that I had followed the letter of our company policy, and there wasn't a thing he could do about it. I stopped by a toy store on my way back to the job site. Still grinning like a lunatic when I made my purchase, I made sure to save the receipt. My phone chimed with another email. I opened it. It was only marked with exclamation points. It was a picture of an expense report, with the cost of the fifth wheel highlighted, and surrounded by several red question marks. I took the plastic children's sheriff badge I had purchased and affixed it to my jacket below my name and company logo, making sure to hold the receipt next to it, and took a picture. I sent it to Tom's email, with a note. My own highlighted section of our company policy about expenditures on reasonable lodging and performance of our work, and a note that I expected to be reimbursed for my additional equipment. His two-word response put a smile on my face for the rest of the day. Well played. The workday concluded, and the guys had begun shuttering the job site for the evening. I took a revolver from my duffel bag. A large caliber handgun loaded with snake shot that I usually brought along to jobs for dispatching venomous wildlife that do like to occasionally occupy warm engine compartments of our equipment. I'd only had to use it once in the last 5 years. As usual, I didn't like having to use it on animals, unless I absolutely had to. But the weight of it on my hip brought me a bit of comfort, as more of a deterrent if I did end up encountering some thief trying to steal anything not bolted down during the evening. I moved many of the standing work lights around, strategically placing them, so if I flipped the switch, most of the job site would be illuminated. Satisfied with my little defense perimeter, I laid down for the evening with my laptop to watch something brainless, as I kept watch for the night. The sun had just passed behind the horizon when the first problems began. The first was a group of teenagers, who I caught trying to scale the fence. I was making a round, walking the fence line when I spotted them. Just a group of kids really, not real criminals. I could hear the cans of spray paint rolling around in their backpacks as they tried to mount the fence. I hit the remote start button on my fob for the generator, hooked up to the perimeter lights, and made sure that the first thing they saw was me silhouetted against the light, with my hand on my gun. They fled instantly. I waited until I couldn't hear the cans rattling in their backpacks anymore, before I finally started to laugh. I never would have hurt them, but I'd already had enough spray paint happy vandals for one trip. The building was pretty much covered in a variety of graffiti, ranging from actually not bad street art to many variations on vulgar insults, and a recurring theme of various distressing words like run, hide, and watch out. Seeing them all over the walls made me feel a little sad about how callous some people could be about a real tragedy. I pressed the off button on the fob for the generator. It wound down and the lights dimmed. I was back in total darkness. I was waiting for my eyes to adjust to the dim moonlight when I heard a noise coming from within the job site. I began walking back up toward the building itself, hoping to keep my element of surprise by being as quiet as I could, straining my ears to try and locate the source of the noise. As I approached the building, I could tell the sounds were coming from inside the hollowed-out building itself. The empty concrete walls made trying to pinpoint the source nearly impossible, as echoes bounced back and forth down the hallways and corridors. The confidence I'd been feeling from putting a little scare into the kids faded away into cold dread and goosebumps, as now I could hear what the sounds actually were. They were sobs. Not "I lost my job" or "my significant other left me" cries, but the deep heart-wrenching sobs of someone in genuine anguish. I changed tactics, fumbling around my pockets for my flashlight. At some point in your life you'll encounter the kind of cries I'm talking about. They have an effect on your heart. My mindset changed from needing to run off whatever was trespassing on the site, to needing to locate, and perhaps aid someone in distress. I flipped on my flashlight, entering the building. expecting to see maybe one of the local unhoused, or maybe some kind of teenage runaway, as the mournful wails continued to bounce off the walls, making them sound like they were coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I felt my heart rate go up a few more notches as I swept my light down hallways, walking up and down the length of the building. The actual building was only about 34,000 square feet. There just aren't that many places to hide. I walked down a rubble-strewn hallway that had been the most recent to be demolished. It ended, opening up to the outside again, where that section of the building had already been torn down.
The sobbing abruptly stopped. Then a blood-curdling scream erupted in my ears, and something hit me hard in the back, sending me to the ground with incredible force. My head slammed into one of the piles of concrete, and little points of light began to swim in my vision. Before everything went dark, I heard a word whispered harshly into my ear. Hide. I startled awake with my forehead throbbing in pain. I put my hand on my face and felt something wet dripping over my eyebrow. I peered around, trying to get my eyes to focus on anything. My eyes finally fixed on the only source of light, my flashlight. It had tumbled off the edge of the concrete foundation. Its upward beam illuminated the tree it had come to rest against. I pulled myself up from the concrete floor, giving myself a moment to make sure my feet were going to stay underneath me. I managed to get their cooperation and reached down to pick up my flashlight. When the sobbing started again, I pointed the flashlight all about the area, trying in an even more futile effort than before to locate the sound. Now the blood trickling from my forehead was starting to run into my right eye. I wiped away the blood as best I could, but anyone can tell you, head wounds like to bleed a lot. I was standing in an open area near the partially demolished hallway, when my ears finally fixed on where the sound had been emanating from the open hallway leading back into the facility. Holding one hand to my forehead and squinting out of one eye, I scanned the hallway with the beam of my flashlight. A fresh wave of nausea overtook me, and I had to steady myself against the wall with the hand I was using to try and control the bleeding. I looked down for a moment, feeling both too hot and too cold at the same time. The cusp of light caught something my eyes were trying to focus on. Blood on the floor, not droplets, but a pattern, a shoe print. Still holding myself up, I tried to examine myself, to see if I'd been injured somewhere else and hadn't noticed due to my throbbing head. I closed my eyes and let the wave of nausea recede a bit, before taking a second look at myself. No blood or scrapes, no tears in my pants. The sobs cried out again, this time from somewhere directly in my vicinity. I redoubled my efforts to steady myself. I moved the beam over the footprint, and two things finally clicked into place. It's not my blood, and it's not my footprint, or rather footprints. This was definitely the pattern of an athletic shoe, not my heavy patterned work boot. I traced down the hallway, and I found a trail of them. Another sobbing moan snapped me out of my focus, and brought my attention back to the more pressing issue. Someone out there, besides me, was clearly hurt. I pressed my legs back into motion, following the footprints to the source of the sobs. The footprints smeared and made a sharp left through a heavy steel door, and a large pool of blood had formed from under it. I took my gun out of its holster, rested my hand on the knob for half a second, inhaled sharply, and flung the door open. The scene I came upon was what nightmares wanted to be when they grew up. My heart followed my stomach right down through the floor, as my eyes settled upon the two bodies lying sprawled against each other on the floor. They leaned against the back wall against one another, a man and a woman in matching blue uniforms. His body partially draped across hers, both with obvious signs of injuries that could not have been anything short of absolutely fatal. I turned away from the gruesome sight before my mind had a chance to memorize any more of the details. Okay, I thought. No more playing hero for me tonight.
Time to call actual authorities. I pressed the flashlight into the crook of my neck and began fishing around my coat pockets for my phone. I managed to get 911 punched into the phone as I turned my back on the two bodies when I nearly bumped into someone standing directly in front of me. The screen turned from the black of the dial pad to the bright white of active calling, illuminating the figure right there. The light shone upon what was left of a face. Ghost white flesh on one half stood out in sharp contrast to the grotesque lack of it on the other. Empty white eyes stared sightlessly into mine. The mouth opened, and a single word escaped what semblance of a mouth remained. Leave. In a purely visceral reaction, I flung myself backward away from this new horror, only for my feet to find the slick pool in the doorway, resulting in my rapid falling backward. My hands were full with guns and phones, and the back of my head struck the floor with all my weight behind it. This time it wasn't little points of light I saw, rather stars exploded across my vision. The terrible pain I already felt redoubled, and for the second time in a span of 10 minutes or less, darkness swept the world away. The next thing I knew, I was back on the job. I looked up from my clipboard to see my guys back to the task at hand. Jackhammers and engine noise filled the air. I was talking with Ramirez about where to place our new arrival of dumpsters without looking up from my paperwork. Something was bothering me, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. It was like I was struggling to read the paperwork at all. Ramirez had his back to me, looking at site plans, pointing to a location for the dumpsters. Wait, Ramirez, when did you get out of jail? Legal said they couldn't do anything about it until Friday. I asked his back. He replied, yes sir, they let me. What did you say? I asked, the alarm rising in my chest. Leave, he repeated in a voice that was distinctly not his own. Awareness washed cold dread over me as I realized the noise of the job site had dropped a few octaves. I looked around to see none of my guys were working anymore. They still held tools in their hands, machinery still running, but they were all just standing there with backs towards me. I got up from the log I was sitting on and grabbed Ramirez by the shoulder, turning him towards me. Hey, I asked you. But when I turned him to face me, the words died in my mouth. The face was still his, but below the brim of his hard hat were two white eyes that stared out lifelessly at me. Leave, he said in a hollow whisper. No, I stammered. I looked around for help to find all my guys now facing me with those same vacant white eyes. They all began to whisper the words, leave, or run, or hide. Then they repeated them, over and over again. Leave, run, hide, until it was all I could hear, their voices rising in a terrible chorus, pressing in on me from all sides, the whispers becoming shouts, becoming screams, becoming a roar that threatened to shatter my eardrums and crack my sanity. I woke up to the sound of my own screaming. I was still lying in the doorway with John shaking me awake. Ellen, calm down. The bright light of his flashlight brought fresh waves of pain shooting through my skull. I brought my arm up to shield my eyes, but still used the available light to look behind me into the room behind the door. No bodies. They were gone. I checked the ground around me. No blood. My ears still rang with the sound of my own screams, and the echoes of the whispers still playing in my mind. I sucked in a breath as John put a hand on my shoulder. What happened to you? He asked, with deep concern in his voice. My heart was beating so hard and fast, I barely registered the sound of his voice. I fell, was all the reply I could muster at the moment. His flashlight traced over to my revolver, lying on the ground. Then back to me, and more specifically, the little yellow plastic sheriff's badge pinned to my jacket, which was now spattered with droplets of my own blood. You're lucky you didn't end up with a self-inflicted wound, or something worse. Come on, you ridiculous idiot. That gash on your head is going to need stitches. He heaved me to my feet, in a way that brought new waves of pain shooting through my body. But I took it, just happy to have a companion in my misery. John threw my arm over his shoulder, and walked me out of the facility, back toward my trailer. A few moments later, a police officer rolled up to the lot, in response to my 911 call. But John confronted the officer, flexing his authority, assuring the officer it was a simple accident and misunderstanding. The officer seemed more than willing to leave, well enough alone, as I imagined this would be a lot of paperwork on his part. When some of the pain receded, and I managed to collect myself enough, I asked, "So what are you doing here?" I stared at John from beneath a makeshift bandage pressed to my forehead. "Well, I came here to tell you what a terrible idea it is to stay here overnight, or really, on these grounds at all," he replied. "This soil is contaminated, and tomorrow the EPA will be here to close the site. I wanted to deliver the news personally to you before the EPA got here, and confiscated all your company's equipment for potential contaminants." He gave me an almost smug look. I could only stare back at him blankly. "I've been trying to shut this place completely down for several years of my time in public service," he said. Perhaps not really to me, as he was looking out the window of my trailer out into the night. He seemed to be saying it to himself, trying to pierce the darkness by sheer force of will. "Nothing good has ever come of this land, or anything ever built on it. And it hurts everyone who steps foot here," he mused aloud, still staring into the dark. "Come on, I'll take you to get your head stitched up. Then I recommend you start making phone calls to get your equipment and this very expensive trailer off the site by morning." After a quick trip through the ER for 10 stitches and a fresh tetanus shot for my troubles, I started to make phone calls, waking up every single one of my guys, not currently residing in a drunk tank. I ordered them to come back to the job and begin the hasty process of getting everything loaded back onto the trucks and moved to an open lot off the highway. I fired up every generator we had and hooked up every single work light available to illuminate the entire area. Tired, battered, and still feeling the ache of fleeing adrenaline, I must have looked a bit like a madman to my guys. Head bandaged, still sporting my blood-covered jacket, shouting orders that no one is to be alone. Always travel in pairs wherever you go, and so on. They were giving me a wide berth by the time we'd gotten the last piece of equipment loaded. A chorus of groans answered my next order to utilize my expanded job duties, and ordered everyone to load up and drive back to the home office right away. I stayed behind for another 2 hours, until I could pick up the stragglers from jail. They gave me bewildered looks, as I told them to get in the truck, that we're going home. After some assurances that their personal belongings had been collected from the hotel, and that our company wasn't also filing for bankruptcy, that yes, they did indeed still have jobs, they all climbed aboard. I passed one of my guys, Ramirez, the keys. "You're driving, I'm getting some sleep." That's all I said, even though he clearly had more questions. The obvious relief on his face was all but too apparent. I sat in the passenger seat watching the town disappear over the horizon in the morning light. "Sir, there was something really wrong with that place, wasn't there?" "Is that why we had to leave?" asked Ramirez. I involuntarily shuddered at the last word. "Circumstances beyond our control," I said as I began to doze off out of sheer exhaustion. I watched him cross himself as my eyelids fell. No kidding, I thought to myself, before sleep took me away from that awful place. I turned in my 2 weeks the next day, deciding I'd had enough of wielding the sword of progress. John sent me an email, updating me on the land's fate. He had succeeded in not only proving the soil contamination,
but also in tying up any further efforts to use the land for nearly any purpose. In such a nice little package of bureaucratic red tape, the place was pretty much walled off from anyone ever setting foot on it. For the foreseeable future, I felt a wash of relief at this news, partially because it meant no one would be harmed, but also the soil contamination helped explain what happened to me. I must have been exposed to it, and hallucinating. The feeling was short-lived. Attached to the email was a single photo of a young man in a blue uniform, John's son, and I recognized his face. Well, I should say, I recognized half of it, and will never forget it, as long as I live. The other half was missing, just like the apparition that had ordered me to leave.
Stuck in Time, from Spooty Tunes. I'll start my story off by saying this is the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me. This will be my first time ever sharing these events. Some details and names have been changed for anonymity's sake. The date was November 16th, 2019. I'd recently moved to a new apartment complex somewhere in Colorado. My new job at a well-known hardware store was running me ragged due to preparation for the upcoming Black Friday and holiday madness that was quickly approaching. I'd been working late and finally arrived back at home. I was finally climbing into my soft, warm bed. I sighed and tucked myself in. I looked around my dark room first. There was a faint glow from the outside street lights creeping in through the window. Something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling. Everything looked in place all around me, but somehow it didn't feel quite right. The air seemed charged with a strange electricity, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should be. I shook it off, telling myself I was simply exhausted from work, and I really needed some sleep. I set my alarm on the nightstand beside me, and started to slowly close my eyes. I was later jolted awake to the sound of a vintage-style alarm clock going off. I didn't think much of that at first, because I was ticked off that my alarm had gone off so soon in the first place. "What the heck?" I said angrily as my eyes adjusted, expecting to see my dark room. But to my surprise, there was light outside. And as the confusion set in, I started to get more and more disoriented. As I realized, I wasn't in my room at all. Orange-tinted, 1970 style wallpaper covered the walls, and all my posters and belongings were gone. There were just these boxes everywhere, and loads of them. I started to panic. I reached over to check my phone, and realized it was gone. In its place was an old-school alarm clock and a magazine of women's fashion that looked like something my mother would have worn when she was a teenager. I started to think that maybe I was having a dream. Yeah, that must be it. I attempted to pinch myself and yelped in pain when I realized I was very much awake. That's when I heard a woman's voice calling me from the other room. "Linda darling, are you finally awake? We have to be leaving soon. Get yourself up and get dressed." I sat there dumbfounded, frozen in confusion and terror. "Linda? Who's Linda?" I whispered softly. I slowly pulled myself from the bed and walked to a door that I assumed was my closet. Inside the closet was a bunch of vintage-looking clothing that looked like the sort of things that girls from the Brady Bunch would wear. I picked out the least ugly patterned dress and held it in my hands, still trying to figure out what in the world was going on. All of a sudden, I heard a little giggle. I whipped around to see a little girl with blonde hair tied into little braided pigtails. "Linda, Mom wanted me to come check on you. We're gonna be late if you don't get out of here soon," she said, as she squeaked the door back and forth. "Who are you?" I blurted out, and further panicked. "What?" she said, with shocked voice. "I'm your sister Lisa." "Silly, are you feeling okay? Did you fall on your head or something?" Just before I could answer, the woman I'd heard calling me before came walking up behind Lisa. "What's the holdup, Linda?" she said sternly. "We have to get going soon. Put on that dress and get out here." The woman appeared to be in her late 30s. She had curly, light brown hair, and blue eyes, wearing a grayish-blue dress. I blinked a few times as she huffed and walked away with the little girl running behind her. I decided to get dressed, heading out to meet up with the woman and little girl. Obviously something was very wrong, but if I wanted to find out what that was, I had to play along. As I headed out of the room, I noticed everything in the house was boxed up. I looked around the house and noticed everything. The furniture, wallpaper, the clothing, all looked to be from the 1970s. My eyes finally landed on a calendar on the wall. The date read, November 1974. Below, the days had been crossed out, except for what I assumed was today's date, the 16th. I was in awe, dazed, trying to figure out where I was, when the woman's voice boomed out of the kitchen. "Linda," she shouted. "In the car this instant, young lady. Your sister is already outside. We have to go now." I ran with her to the car and climbed inside. The car was what looked to be a 70s green Ford Pinto wagon. The woman started to pull back out of the driveway when she snapped at me. "If we're late meeting up with your father this time, you're in trouble. This is the second time this week we've been late. Because of you. You've got to start being more responsible." "I'm sorry," I said, with a stutter. Just before I could say any more, a passing vehicle slammed on their brakes as a nearby car spun out and headed right at us. I screamed along with the other passengers, and everything went dark. Gradually I began to wake up to a faint familiar sound. My actual alarm clock. My eyes slowly began to adjust, and I realized I was back in my room, my beautiful room. I immediately grabbed my cell phone to see it was now November 17th, 2019. I let out a deep sigh and started to cry. What happened? Who were those people? All these thoughts were racing through my mind, but I had to get ready for work. The day went on like any other, but still, the thoughts about what happened were racing through my head. As I was sweeping down an aisle, I saw this little old lady. I started up a friendly conversation with her and asked if she had ever heard anything about a car accident that took place back in the 70s. She looked up at me with sudden sadness in her eyes. "Ah yes," she said slowly. "When I was a little girl, I used to play over at my friend Lisa's house. She and her family were getting ready to move to a new place. It was around November of 74, if I recall." She seemed so somber. Lisa, her sister Linda, and their mother Margaret were heading off to meet up with her father with another load of boxes to put in their new home, when an intoxicated driver spun out and collided with their car. It was such a tragedy. The only one left alive was the driver who caused the crash. "That's horrible," I said. The old woman and I exchanged a few more words. Then we finished up our conversation as she wished me a good day and walked off. When I got back home from work, I did a little bit of digging online. I found some old photos of the family from the accident in question. Sure enough, it was the woman and little girl and her sister, whose body I briefly inhabited. I was in shock. The apartment I lived in now stood where a few old houses once were, including the house that family once lived in. They'd been torn down to make room for the apartment complex. Nothing like this moment has ever happened to me since, and I'm not sure why I was briefly stuck in the past with these people. Perhaps it was to live out their final moments with them, to share their story so they wouldn't be forgotten. Or perhaps it was just a very weird dream and a massive coincidence. I don't know. All I know is I hope their spirits can be at peace. It's a weird world we live in, and some things simply can't be explained. The ghosts of the past haunt us, 99% of the time. That phrase is just a metaphor concerning trauma, mistakes and events from our pasts. But in the rare cases like tonight's tales, this phrase is quite literal. Some dead things are very angry about being dead, and they want people who still have a pulse to hear about it. Thanks for listening to another episode of Tales from the Break Room. If you're a fan, please follow and review Tales from the Break Room on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or your favorite podcast app.
You can also listen to us on the Darkness Prevails YouTube channel. Have your scary work story narrated by sending it to us at ericast.com/submit. Also, if you really want to support us and unlock tons of exclusive scary content, sign up to be a member at ericast.com+, where you can listen to members-only audiobooks and bonus episodes, get early access to certain upcoming podcasts, and listen to all Ericast shows without ads. Thank you. For now, it's time for me to clock out. But don't you worry, I'll be clocking back in real soon.